Hi, welcome to the New Voting Project. My name is Kunal, your host, and today we are honored to have Paul Loeb on the show here at the New Voting Project, an American social and political activist who attended Stanford University and New York's New School for Social Research and worked actively to end the Vietnam War. Though it seemed like a long time ago, I still study that in school. It's actually, I'm having a test on it, so maybe we can talk about that a little later.
I'll give you the answers.
Exactly. You are also the author of this book right here. I'm holding in front of me, Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in a Cynical Time, which has over 170,000 copies in print. It's a fantastic read for all you aspiring activists and politicos out there. And you also helped found the Campus Election Engagement Project, a national nonpartisan effort to get more college students involved in civic engagement and elections across the United States. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Glad to be here.
Of course. All right. So let's get into these questions. Just for the first one, for the viewers, talk a little bit about your background and touch on how your education at Stanford at New School kind of prepared you to take on the roles that you did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I came up, as you mentioned, I came up in a particular time with particular challenges, with Vietnam being one of the salient ones, and got involved in, well, I guess actually sort of in high school, and originally started out as a supporter of the war, and then changed as I learned more, and ended up leading some student strikes, and was heavily involved, and then went on to Stanford, was really active there. And I think one of the lessons, well, a couple of lessons came out of that period. Not necessarily, I wasn't thinking that much in terms of electoral elections at that point, retrospectively, much more so. But one is that citizens really did, if they acted and persisted long enough, had the power to change major policies. The other, less happy lesson is that movements were perfectly capable of metaphorically and sometimes occasionally literally blowing themselves up and destroying their own ability to make change by just letting their anger completely run wild and not being strategic and driving away potential supporters. And both were really true. Both continue to be true at this point. And so that's sort of, those are lessons that carried with me going forward. I think electorally, it took me a while because sometimes I know you start out and you're really involved in the issue, and it's easy to get purist. And there's a concept that I write about in Soul of a Citizen called the perfect standard, which is about how people often sort of apply it to activists and say they just have to be absolutely perfect. And if there's any contradiction, you could never take a car to drive to a climate change demonstration because that would be betraying everything, except that might be the only way you could get there. And so it's a way of writing off and dismissing social change. But people also certainly apply it to elections, and they apply it to the candidates. And sometimes you work really hard for, say, in the primaries for a candidate, and they don't make it through the primary. And so then you have a choice. And I think oftentimes people feel like, how to say it, it's that voting is, this is the thing Rebecca Solnit actually wrote about pretty well. One of her essays is, that it's sort of like a romance, and it's like the person you love, the person who is your soulmate, and this candidate is the person who's just going to carry all your hopes. And sometimes if you are in the right point of history accidentally, and you work really hard, and others do, that can happen. But more often, what happens is you've got two people. They have strengths, they have flaws, they have things you agree with, they have things you don't agree with. And one of them is going to exercise power, sometimes significant power, everywhere from, a city council person to a mayor, to a governor, to a legislator, to a congressperson, senator, or president. And so people get in the box of the purist trap, which is just sort of like, well, if it's not the person that I want, I'm going home. And I think I saw some of that kind of came as a legacy out of the 60s. It happens reoccurrently in citizens movements. And so I think one of the things that I've learned certainly in the period since is just the value of being persistent for a long-term vision, but also being practical and pragmatic and saying, okay, here's the choice. Who you vote for is going to determine, along with who others vote for, who's going to be in office, and you can't back away from it just because the candidates aren't necessarily ideal. So I think that was in some sense a legacy that came out of that experience.
Yeah, and I'll be one to tell you, there's a special election happening in a district near to me tomorrow. So there's a lot of pressure riding on my candidate and the establishment. But yeah, no, thank you for that insight. I
Yeah.
can definitely relate. Um, Now let's move towards your work with campus election engagement project. That effort that you started. Explain kind of why you wanted to increase, voter turnout, voter education
Yeah.
at the collegiate level, and what you ultimately hope to accomplish.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because now, I mean, I've just recently phased out from running it, and we've got just a neat CEO named Maxim Thorin, who's
Right,
a vice president of the NAACP and Human
right.
Rights Campaign, and just a
Who's more than
real,
welcome to come on the show, by the way.
yeah, yeah. He's still getting his feet wet with a million different, fundraising calls and this and that. But very, very impressive person. And in my case, what happened was this was 2008, and because books like Soul of a Citizen, and there's another book of mine, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, that also really took off. And they took off particularly on campuses. So, tens of thousands of them were being read. And I was doing a lot of speaking at college campuses and speaking at conferences. And in 2008, as people may recall, or what they read, is there was a lot of energy around Obama's initial run, and there was a lot of youth energy. And it struck me that schools could do a lot to get people, all of their students, whether they opposed Obama or they supported Obama, to get them to participate. And they had to, if you're acting as an institution, you really have to be neutral. You really, it's just not appropriate to take a stand on one candidate or another. So the question is, were there things that they could legitimately do that would help all the students on their campuses vote? And the answer was that there were. And what those things were, a few of them I had a instinctual guess at the beginning. Most of them would be revealed over time, as we learned. So I jumped in, raised a little bit of money from some people who helped fund some of the outreach on the books, and worked through a lot of existing networks. And basically, the goal was to still is to have a campus take responsibility for getting its students to vote. And so what does that mean? That means everything from helping them register, obviously, in most states that's a requirement, and navigating them through the registration laws, and navigating through, in most of the states where we worked, the often really pretty daunting and, I would argue, problematic voting laws that were aimed on, in some cases, to prevent them from voting. But the schools could do a lot, and sometimes had to. I mean, Ohio's laws are almost benign now compared to a lot of the places, but they were one of the first to do some of the voter ID laws. And one of the things that was accompanying that is, if you were living on campus and you wanted to register to vote, you had to have a letter from the
Right,
president or chancellor to
right.
be able to register. So it wasn't just like optional for the school; it was mandatory if they wanted the students to vote. But I remember that very first year, like in '08, the law had just been passed, I think, and most of the schools had no clue, because, I mean, there's a sort of government relations department and they're maybe taking note of it. But the people, the faculty, the student affairs, they had no sense of it. And they literally just didn't know. And then a few schools had, met them, and we used what the initial schools as templates for the others. And we did that in general, which is a school would come up with a great idea and then let's replicate it. And so the project started in '08. I then sort of went away and thought, oh, okay, I'm going to go back to writing, and did another edition of the edition you read of Soul is the second edition that I wrote during that period. But I sort of thought, oh, well, those schools will know what to do, and of course, you know, one of the lessons of change is you got to keep at it, and you got to keep monitoring it, and so they absolutely did not, and comes 2010, and the turnout just completely plummets. Not just on campus, and not just with youth, but did. And so I'm thinking, well, I guess maybe they're going to need a little bit more help and encouragement and cajoling and nudging and all that. And so then relaunched in 2012, initially for presidential, and then later for off years, and then year round, because what you do in one year builds the ground for the next. Like getting voter registration or orientation, or getting a student ID that meets voting ID standards for the state, those kinds of things, or an election day holiday, or a polling station. And so a lot of it was just really just kind of about the practical ways that a school could, again, navigate students through, like on the voting laws. The metaphor that I've always used is, I think it's like a bunch of like half dozen pits of alligators between you and the voting booth, and there you are, and you're like, oh, here I am, I'm at school, and I guess I could vote, but here are these alligators, and big teeth, and they look hungry, and I don't really care about it that much, so I'm staying home. And metaphorically speaking, I felt like our job was to build a kind of bridge around, so you didn't have to fall into the alligators, and encourage people to vote that wasn't that hard. So something like that, including encouraging students to volunteer. It became pretty clear, I think, by the relaunch in 2012. They said, well, do you have like, are there candidate guides, because our students don't really know the candidates, and how do they distinguish them? And I said, well, doesn't the League of Women Voters do that? And they're like, well, yeah, and then they do, but they're really long, and our students aren't going to read that long. So we developed the format for these. If you go to guides.vote, you can sort of, you can see our guides, a format for these guides where it was really, it evolved over 7 or 8 years, but the basic concept, which is, here's an issue: climate change, voting rights, reproductive rights, or pro-con on legalized abortion, and they would be neutral, and they would basically, tax policy, student financial aid, and essentially they would say where do the candidates stand. And as it got more sophisticated, it would be, where do they stand, but here's a link, like a quote with a link to a mainstream media source, so that you could really follow it out and understand that this was credible, and not just like somebody's grabbing something off of a friend's Facebook posting or something that may or may not be true. And we got a whole team of veteran journalists to participate. A lot of them volunteered their time, and then a lot of off-campus groups ended up using them, which was really cool. From vote.org to Black Voters Matter to Rock the Vote to lots and lots of groups. And so but that was something that, again, we didn't really think of. I didn't think of at the very beginning, but then when the schools started asking it was like, okay, well, I guess we better come up with something. And again, landed. It's interesting when I look at those very first guides. Yeah, they're different. They're not quite as sophisticated, but they're still the same basic concept, which is, okay, here's a candidate. Where do they stand?
Right.
Yeah. And then, by now it's, where do they stand, and how do you know that that's where they stand? And that's where we, start hyperlinking them and the rest of that. So, and then just, and we start working with the schools, no idea at first, like, would they respond? I did know a lot of people through my lecturing, but still, like, I'm telling them what to do. Are they going to say, hell with you, or are they going to say, yeah, good idea? And somehow we managed to frame it in a way that they said, yeah, good idea, we're happy to help. And, gradually over time built up relationships with the schools. To
Right.
the point where they're sort of looking to us and they're saying, "Hey, when are your guides going to be ready? What about that essay a while back about political cynicism? Our students would be kind of useful for that." So that kind of thing.
Yeah. And, in my humble opinion, I would argue that these kinds of, projects, these kinds of, like basically a database of information about local politics, whether it be national or federal or municipal at the very least, they should be institutionalized. Folks
Yes.
need to understand that when it comes to policies that directly impact you, is that road going to be built? Is that street lamp going to turn on? Are my, is my electric? Why is my electricity bill so high? Let's blame PG&E for once.
Right.
But that's just because I live in California. It's
Where they burn everything down.
yeah, apparently. And then they tell us to not use, the AC when it's 90 degrees outside and
Right.
the
Right.
sky is orange. Uh,
Right.
so those kinds of acts need to really be ingrained as extremely important
Yeah. Yeah.
in changing how our societies function. But I guess I want to move on and ask, you obviously were very successful in your career as an author. Um,
Right.
but why did you? There's so many facets of influencing policy. Like I work on a lot of campaigns. I
Right.
spend my time learning about candidates, understanding them, going out, walking door to door, strategizing, raising money, everything in between. Because
Yeah.
I like my niche, right? But why choose becoming an author? Writing, analyzing. Why take that path?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, because I started out, again, it wasn't about campaigns, but it was about activism. I started out acting. Well, see, one thing led into that. So, I mean, even I go back to Stanford, there were, at that point, this is pre-Silicon. I mean, Silicon, Hewlett Packard had been started, but it was, very nascent Silicon Valley. And it was kind of a backwater almost. And I remember where there was a lot of Stanford itself was in the top, I can't remember, top 40, top 30 military contractors in the country. I mean, it was way up there. And, to try and make our case for why this wasn't an appropriate university function, which we didn't think it was, what did I do? Well, we wrote an op ed in the Stanford Daily. And, because then we can show it to people and we can say, here are our arguments. So
Right.
I think from, the beginning for me, writing became interwoven with activism, um, and then later on, after college, there was a small political magazine called Liberation that very illustrious history, had been around 20 years, and like Martin Luther King had written Letter from Birmingham Jail in its pages, and Nelson Mandela had written for it, and some pretty amazing global figures. Most of them were dead or gone by the time I got around.
Right.
um, and and it was sort of like, okay, well, what do we need to be talking about now? What are the issues? How do we look at the culture? And so I think and that was where I sort of did some of my very first writing, and it was, how to describe it. I mean, and then this is just for me, because I have friends who are writers and they just love to write, and so they will write about anything, and it'll be, sometimes it'll be very good writing, but for me, I think the writing would be to serve some purpose. And that doesn't mean, how to describe it, doesn't mean distorting reality. I mean, that there's way too much of that, and there's too much writing that does that. So it means being true to reality, but woven in is saying, hey, I want people to think about something. I want them to think about something that might affect the world. Um, and so that always drove my writing from the start. And occasionally, at the very beginning, I was writing about all sorts of things that maybe weren't very political. But I think that where I really found my voice, it was writing about people's relationship to the world and to larger issues. I did a book on. It was at that point the largest nuclear complex in the world that had created materials for the first, not for Hiroshima, but for the Nagasaki bomb, and how people were dealing with that legacy, and in some ways avoiding that legacy, and so I think the issues were always kind of driving the writing. And then later, I sort of flipped the script. And when I started Campus Election Engagement Project, then, well, I kind of stopped doing writing,
Mhm.
partly because I'm going to sort of really express myself and think about everything I believe in, and it's tied to a nonpartisan project. Then, if I'm, honest about, this particular person's choice or this other person's choice, it can come back to bite us. And so now, I sort of just now reclaiming my voice is like, okay, I'm no longer running it, and they're doing what they're doing, and which I still highly supportive of, and in every way I can, but I can be freer in my own voice. I think that's sort of part of the evolution. Um,
Yeah, yeah, no. I think writing is like we were talking. Writing is and reading, understanding, and amplifying those issues is kind of how we learn as a
yeah,
um, everything that I guess I could ever recall had to have come from some pages within a book.
right,
Um,
or an
and then of
article, or
course,
yeah,
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 and then of course translated in an experience that I've probably had in the political sphere. Uh,
right,
so yeah, no, I'm not knocking it at all. I just
yeah.
wanted to know why.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But I
uh,
think that is the genesis. Is that for me, which
yeah,
again, different from other folks, it was trying to make an argument. Um, I mean, it's interesting. I just finished. I guess really sort of the first piece I'll publish post campus election engagement project is I was reading the book Ari Berman's excellent book Give Us the Ballot on the sort of post voting rights, post 65 voting rights bill struggle for voting rights. And one of the things that I did not know was that when the act got reauthorized in 82,
yeah,
Bob Dole was the hero. I mean, there was nobody who played a more critical role than Bob Dole. And Dole was basically quite conservative, Kansas senator, majority leader later, Republican candidate for president, and I didn't know this facet of his background, and it really it fascinated me. So I just wrote a piece, and I don't know. It's a very long shot that it'll have the intended effect, but I talked about Dole really being genuinely courageous in challenging his party to stand up on voting rights. And I sort of put out a moral call to, well, there aren't that many Republican moderates, but the you know Mitt Romney's, the Lisa Murkowski, Susan
right,
Collins, so it's running, in the Salt Lake City paper, and I've sent you the main paper and the Alaska paper. It's like at least they'll read it. They'll read the argument, and the argument was, you ought to step up on the filibuster as well, and don't duck responsibility on these Voting Rights Act if you say you believe in Voting Rights Act, right?
right.
In voting rights, again, I don't know. I mean, it's a long, uh, I probably have better odds of getting breakthrough COVID than changing one of those senators' minds.
I don't doubt that. But
But nonetheless, you make the try, and you make the argument, and you make the moral appeal, and you see what happens.
exactly.
You know,
Can't hurt to try.
and it
One
can't hurt to try. Yeah,
right. One thing I can't almost fathom is that voting rights is so central to our democracy
yeah,
that both parties, and at some point, we can have a philosophical debate about what these parties actually,
yeah,
funnel down to. But the dire polarization between those two, diametrically opposed, principally and ideologically, parties is that both should be encouraging the right to vote. It's better for both parties if more
right.
Americans
Yeah,
are getting out and voting on
yeah,
their beliefs. And I actually want to turn to 2020 and talk about it,
right.
because the voter turnout, some about 160 million. Joe Biden, of course, won a couple more million in the popular vote, but
About 70 more
it's
million. Yeah,
yeah, it's really interesting to see this conservative reaction and voter suppression laws and voter restriction laws across conservative states in the in our country after such a such a great election where all the scholars were
Right.
saying, this is what democracy is supposed
Right,
to feel
because
like.
their people turned out, and the Democratic folks turned out, and that's a that's a good and that participation is a good thing on both sides. So yeah, they should have, it's like, hey, all right, how else do we get more people to turn out?
Right.
And and it's very, I guess that's why the Bob Dole, you know reading that just really resonated with me. It's like, what, Everett Dirksen was the majority leader who really was Johnson's prime partner in getting the voting rights bill to begin through in 65. And Dole was the person who, you know, took the lead in 82 when it looked like it was just going to not get renewed. And, we need one of those folks now. We need many of those folks now.
Exactly.
And it saddens me.
Yeah.
Because you can disagree on tax policy, you can disagree on abortion, you can disagree on how to structure, an economy, you can disagree on 100 different things, regulation. You still ought to be able to, you still should feel like the vote's sacrosanct.
Right. Yeah. But we can't be cynics, can we?
Yeah.
I guess that's what the book does.
Yeah. Well, it's actually funny because the original title was, and if you know this, I think what because I think it's in the introduction, but I is originally was the subtitle. It was always Soul of a Citizen,
Right.
but it was the original subtitle was Living with Conviction in Cynical Times.
Right.
And then when you do a new edition of a book, you've got to distinguish it from the old edition in some way, or people are just going to get confused. So, okay, we can't use cynical anymore, and maybe the times are less cynical. I don't know. Maybe they seemed less cynical for a brief window, and so I changed it to Challenging Times, which it certainly is. But now I just feel like, yeah, it should be Cynical Times. But
Yeah.
I don't know if I do a third edition. I guess I can go back to it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just you, but having gone through the intricacies of the political process, I've run elections at every level: municipal, state, federal. I've had a lot of fun. I made a lot of friends. Most of them are on this podcast, who I will plug. But I do feel burned out. I feel, because a majority of the time I'm losing. Sure, there's a couple outlier wins, and yes, I feel good in different districts. Wow, we're actually making some change.
Yeah.
But even getting one person on a conservative city council isn't going to change much. If I tell you honestly, you can be the outlier vote on anything that's progressive, but you'll still lose.
Right.
So I want to ask, how do we as young people, as engaged youth, and maybe those that are also ignorant or just alienated, exhausted with the process, what is your advice to us going into?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly people who are I would call it, I don't know, for lack of a better word, preemptively exhausted. That is, they haven't stepped in yet, but they look at it and they just say it's too much to begin with, so they're not going to step in. And I think there's a lot of those folks, as well as the people who go through the revolving door and get very involved, and then they're gone. It's hard. I mean, I think, because I've been doing this a long time. I started in high school, and so we're talking, gosh, I'm just trying to do the math.
Well, you don't have to say the number on camera. Don't worry.
Yeah, but it's a long time. Let's just say that it's actually more than 50 years, and that's a really long time. So how do you do it? I think you just came back from a run with a friend of mine who we got kicked out of Stanford as anti-war activists together. He was the only draft age person to testify. Pete Knudsen, who's in Soul of a Citizen, testify on the draft, and he's still very active. He was telling me about this, lawsuit on public access to tidelands that, he's kind of spearheading and organizing, people to get involved in, so I think you do it by recognizing a couple things. One is, you don't know which of the many things you're going to do is going to actually be key, in making change. I mean, you just never do. There's no way. I mean, you can look back and say, oh yeah, this is clearly a historical turning point, but no one at any historical turning point recognized in advance that that was going to be I mean, they knew they might say, yeah, this is a real key lever for change. This might make, real difference. We could see where if you do this, then something else will happen, but it's nothing you can ever guarantee. So, to be able to just say, okay, you're going to try this, and then you're going to try something else, and you're going to try something else. Now, that doesn't mean that describe it. You still want to be strategic. You still want to think through, all right, here I am, or here's a group of folks. Where can we make the greatest impact?
Mhm.
Where can we apply our energy, our creativity, our vision, our vote, our dollars, our time, all that stuff. How do we draw in other people? How do we multiply the impact? So you always want to be strategic, but and this is really hard. You want to also be able to kind of let go of the results at any point and say, okay, sometimes you're going to win, and sometimes you're not going to win. And if over the course of your life you continue, you're going to win some really important things. You're going to be part of winning some important things, but you're not necessarily going to know in advance. And sometimes you don't know who you're going to bring in. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, this is a story from Soul of a Citizen, but I remember. I mean, whether one likes Obama or not, one certainly, obviously a major historical, figure.
Right.
And I remember talking to I was curious in his genesis, and it turned out that there was at the school he was at accidental. There was in California. There was a former Green Beret who'd come back from Vietnam, disillusioned with the war, and sort of started a student activist group. The student anti-apartheid movement was surfacing around then, so the group was organizing around that, started building it up, trying to get the school to divest from South Africa, that is to basically get rid of any holdings, similar to what people are doing with climate change and fossil fuel companies, to get rid of companies that are invested in South Africa. And what was interesting is that the very first point that Obama ever got involved was, with that group around that movement, but he actually never met that Green Beret because Green Beret I'm blanking on his name, graduated in spring. Obama comes in fall,
Right.
but and they never meet. They never did meet. I think the guy died a couple of years ago, and but the others in the group who carried it on were created something that this young guy from Hawaii participated in, and then he goes on to become, community organizer and becomes a president. So, one can argue, I would argue that that person who started the group had this, very significant, whether good, bad, or whatever, very significant influence on history by bringing Obama in, but never met the guy.
Yeah,
never
no,
knew. So to me,
it transcends its I guess original creation, right?
Yeah, exactly. It translated as original creation. Yeah. So that's just sort of one example that came to mind. I hadn't thought of it in a while, but you just it's the uncertainty, and uncertainty can be bad. I mean, I think a lot of us are dealing with the stresses of the COVID uncertainty after we sort of thought it was beaten back,
Right.
at this point. But uncertainty can also be good in the sense that in any particular effort, you don't know how it's going to really turn out because it's always going to have unforeseen, circumstances, including the question of who do you bring into involvement.
Yeah.
So I think that helps people to keep going, and then you just keep doing one thing and another, and then,
Well,
eventually you look back
far.
after 50 years and you think, damn, guess
Yeah.
we've done a lot of things. Some of them worked, some didn't, but I think the world is at least somewhat better because of the stuff that you've done. That's certainly my perspective. My friend Beats, others I know have been around even longer. So
Yeah. No, I mean, I got this far, so let's see what another 50 years can do.
yeah.
But I guess let's talk about this digital age that you and I live in. I mean, we're having this interview over Zoom,
Right.
right? Crazy if you were to think about, maybe a couple decades ago.
Right. Unthinkable.
and we see TikTok, Instagram, large social media platforms
Right.
that are used, I guess, originally intended to spread information, but I guess are truly just an entertainment service now, for
Right.
some folks. Has social media made, you know, the upcoming generation cynical towards politics?
Yeah. I mean, I have to, I mean, they talk of the digital natives and the non-digital natives, and I'm probably the, you
Right,
know,
and I'm an old soul, so, I'm, impartial to this.
yeah, yeah. So I think I don't swim in it as much as some folks do.
Right,
Um, and certainly the constant distractive phenomenon can make it hard to ask the questions of what's really, what's important, what do you want to do, what do you want to accomplish. I mean, and I think all of us are, digital natives or not, are subject to, hey, there's going to be this little thing that I can hold in my hand has something really interesting, and then I'll go follow it out to something else, and here's somebody else, and they're posting this, and and it's, I mean, there's a whole question of misinformation, and I mean, would be, well, I don't know, a good question whether we would be, if we didn't have social media, would be handling COVID better, possibly. I don't know. And then on the other hand, you look at campaigns that are organized, and people who mobilize this, without these tools, it would be impossible. Um, I guess the challenge to me is always, how do you use? I mean, these mechanisms are here.
right,
There are debates that are legitimate ones over whether they should police lies more aggressively, because it's very clear. I mean, I remember, again, we did a piece at camp, a sort of resource on disinformation and how to understand it for Campus Selection Engagement Project, and I didn't want to come up with anything really. I mean, there's certainly lots of lies, but some of it is so politicized. But the one I ended up was, there was a young guy in, gosh, was he in Romania or I'm blanking, but he'd never been to the U.S. and maybe Belarus or Romania. I can't remember which it was, but somewhere in that corner of the world. And he was a fan of Trump, and he started posting things like, Pope endorses Donald Trump, and a bunch of things that were just not true. I mean, just like, not arguable, not judgment call, not great, just wholly made up.
right,
And they were in the top 10, most viewed postings, way more than, New York Times or CNN or any of the stuff. And it was just this, and he'd never been to the country. He just decided to start posting this stuff, and somehow he had an instinct for that. So I don't know. I guess, how do you use those technologies to promote truth and
right,
not lies? And truth can, you can have different political perspectives in truth,
right,
but it's different from just lies. And then, of course, how do you pressure those institutions that have become the gatekeepers of knowledge for the whole society to have some, not censorial power, but to basically say, you know what, we're just not going to be a platform to promote lies.
but
It's hard.
I have to ask then, what if the disinformation and the lies stems from, for example, the president of the United States,
Right. Yeah.
Donald Trump? What
Right.
do
What do you
we
do?
do then
Right.
when our commander in chief is,
Lying.
yeah,
Yeah. Just completely lying. Yeah. 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 And, um, and it's different. I mean, I go back to Bob Dole. I didn't, he ran for president. I didn't vote for him that time, but I don't think he wasn't in the habit of spreading lies. Um, he had arguments. I disagreed with those arguments.
right,
And, but I could do that and respect him.
exactly,
And when you're simply making things up, then, a press secretary says, well, it's just alternative facts. I think you
I
I
think
think you have to
alternative
have
facts.
you have to work for a culture where there is a sanction and a penalty on lying. I mean, because otherwise you can't really have a good vital democracy if people can just completely get away with lying.
Right. I think the word, just the phrase "alternative facts" is oxymoronic.
Yeah,
I don't. Yeah, I don't. I don't understand.
it's a polite way of saying we're lying, but
Yeah,
it doesn't have the moral stigma. And I think you've got to have the moral stigma on lies. It's just like you this is somebody is lying to you, and it has consequences. I mean, I remember this was after 2016,
Mhm.
and I ran into a young guy at a party. We were just talking, he was a musician, and we were just talking. And I was, asking whether he'd voted or not. And how he voted in the primary, and he was a Bernie supporter. And I said, okay, that's great. And what about the general? And he said, well, Bernie told us to vote our conscience, so I voted third party. And I said, well, I don't think that's what Bernie was saying. And he's, oh, yeah. Well, where did you see this? Well, it was all over the internet. And so, one can make an argument, should somebody vote third party, should they not, whatever. But the point is, he was basing his action on a lie. Bernie was not saying that. By down the general election, he was not saying that. So it's just like, I think it's really tough. And I mean, I think you have to ultimately have, this is something I've been thought about for a long time. What I would call is connected communities versus disconnected. So if you have a lot of sort of horizontal bonds with people,
Uh-huh.
then, you've got some people who potentially can check you when you say, Bernie said vote third party, when Bernie was not saying vote third party and saying the opposite. And then it's like, oh, this actually isn't true. But if you're more isolated, then I think the lies breed more easily. And of course, COVID probably furthered all of it. I'm sure it did, because we're all sort of all hunkered down in isolation.
Right.
But it's much larger than COVID,
So
obviously.
yeah, the type of relationship.
Yeah.
Now, I want to, make an emphasis on our world. Our civilization is riddled with, existential crises across the board. Internationally, you can look at just in the US, some folks don't have access to clean water. There are 500,000 folks on the streets without homes.
Right.
We have to
Right.
deal with climate change. At least my
Right.
generation inherits that.
Yeah. Yeah. I
These
mean,
are,
we
yeah,
had beautiful Seattle summers. Now how we're going to plan for this
yeah.
toxic smoke?
I have a crimson orange sun, and
Right.
every year I'm dealing with fires and extreme heat.
Right.
It
Yeah,
was the
we are
highest
too.
recorded temperature in Sierra Nevada this past summer, like 131 Fahrenheit.
Yeah. I mean,
Crazy numbers.
yeah,
There are demoralizing issues that,
genuinely demoralizing.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
has the human soul and spirit been crushed by the weight of these, seemingly insurmountable problems?
Yeah. I mean, I hope not. I mean, it's, I mean, so, are when I look at something like climate change, and, it's just to see, again, you mentioned the orange sun, just I remember I was in the Bay Area taking the BART. I'm sorry, take the BART to the airport, fly back to Seattle, which of course generates some carbon emissions. And,
Right.
um, then I'm, take the BART, our light rail back, and the sun looks like a post-apocalyptic science fiction novel
Right.
cover, and it's just like, oh, that's what it does now. So I would say that in any situation, certainly I think of this as climate change, there
Mhm.
are a range of outcomes. And the range of outcomes on climate change, which I've written a lot about, are right at this point from pretty bad to absolutely unthinkable apocalyptic. And the difference between pretty bad and unthinkable apocalyptic is really huge.
Right.
I mean, it's significant. It's and it's worth fighting for with everything we've got. but it still means that some of the days they're going to have that apocalyptic sun under the best case scenario, and there's still going to be more hurricanes. And I mean, but we can get through it versus those far reaches of the scenarios where we just, it's almost, it's almost unthinkable cataclysms, which are really real and possible. So to me, it's still in that question of can your actions make a difference? If you don't think your actions can make a difference, then you're not going to act. If you think they can, and they're not going to create a perfect world, but they're still going to make a difference, and maybe some things will be significantly better in the process, and have been, that's worth fighting for.
Right.
And so I guess to me that's part of that question of persisting and longevity of action.
Right. And what can we do, within our own circles or broadly, or using social media to compel, everybody, essentially, nobody, there's no, exclusivity here,
Right.
to believe that their actions can make a difference, as cliche as it sounds.
Yeah, no, as cliche as it sounds, it's really at the heart of it all. Right. So I think you tell the stories because people forget, you tell the stories of actions that made a difference. And, often unexpected ways. Certainly that's tried to do in Soul, but, it's certainly something I've done for a long time. And, and that allows people to see a window of possibility. And then you reiterate again and again that even if you're not going to get the perfect world or get it instantly, that it still matters, that it's still worth fighting for. And I think that's the heart of what you have to do, is to give people a sense. Again, it's we have these posters at Campus Election Engagement Project, your vote matters, because people said my vote doesn't matter. So we're like, okay, your vote does matter. We're going to say it, or our votes matter, change it a little bit. But it's that sense that you don't know the action that you're going to take. I mean, another electoral example, which is a while ago now, 2004, where I was mostly focused on, I wasn't running CEEP, but I was mostly focused on the national stuff. But I knocked on doors in one of the neighborhoods in Seattle, and we had a governor's race, and I got 3 people to vote that day. And it wasn't because I was that brilliant. It was because one of them forgot it was election day, and one didn't know how to return an absentee ballot, and one needed a ride. So all just, total practical things that were all solvable within our, in the little intro that we'd gotten before we went out, and anybody would have had the same results. And then it turns out to be 134 votes in a state of, I can't remember, about 5.5 million at that point, that divides the governors after 3 recounts. And, it's okay, I'm doing some math, and it's like, okay, I got 1/50th of the margin in my 1 day of volunteering.
Wow.
And, that stuck with me. And again, it wasn't, I didn't have to write books to do that. I didn't have to be a speaker. I didn't have to do any, it didn't require any skills except the ability to walk a precinct route. That was it. Almost, most folks could have done it,
No, I remember.
And if they didn't do it by, on foot because they're, too frail or whatever, they could do it by telephone, and have some, somewhat comparable results. I've done both.
Right. I distinctly remember just a couple weekends ago, I was walking for my candidate who's running in the special election. It's pretty, establishment, the Democratic Party and all of that, and versus a progressive social activist attorney. So I'm, of course, on the highly progressive side in one of the most progressive districts in the country, apparently. But folks can't seem to understand the difference because of money in politics. But that's a separate conversation.
Right.
Have a little late. And I remember running into a voter walking the streets. He was tending to his garden. And I come up to him, I have my, leaflets, and I'm passing out information, here's your nearest polling location. And he tells me, I'm not even registered to vote. I stay away from this because I don't know enough about what's going on. I don't know. And I don't have the time to spend hours researching these candidates and making the best decision.
Right.
Um,
Right. That's why we did those candidate guides, and so many
right,
groups used them because people didn't have the time.
right. And I spent 20 minutes, almost 20, 25 minutes with the voter explaining details about this election, why it's happening, who it's happening for, how it's going to affect them. I texted him, I gave him my personal cell phone. I said, "You call me. You have any issues, you call me." And it's a special election in an off year, and so the turnout's going to be relatively low, and the election is going to be decided within a couple thousand votes. I know that for
Right.
a fact.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I know that one vote that I may have convinced could
Yeah.
have made a monstrous impact on the election.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just my little sermon of the day, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it does. And I mean,
Yeah,
like, as I had to stop the email because we're talking, but I was composing an email. Um, we have democracy vouchers, which is a really cool thing in Seattle where you get each person gets four $25 vouchers. And I think it's 25 or 50 now. I can't remember. But basically you sign them and you give them the candidates. And, if it's a household, it's $200. It
wow,
adds up pretty quickly. And,
that's such a great idea. We should do that in California.
yeah, you absolutely should. It's really power, and it's not perfect, and you can just, they tweak the rules each time to kind of, as people try and get around it, and there's PACs pouring money in, and less. But nonetheless, what it does is allows people to run without, you know, just chasing the big donors. It's really a great idea, and I had this idea that we're in a mayor's race, and I emailed the person. I said, you really should do yard signs. They didn't do yard signs the first round. And I said, you've got to do yard signs. And I
Yeah,
said, why don't you also put on, to donate to, or volunteer or donate, including democracy vouchers, visit lorenaforseattle.com or .org, I guess. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a pretty good idea. And, and it came out in part because I was my neighbor, we have a block party, and my neighbor had said, hey, I still have my democracy vouchers. Who should I give them? I said, just give them to Lorena. She really can use them. So, um, it's a way of recognizing that people's actions get multiplied. And in that email, I was reminding the city councilwoman, who was a friend of mine, who's also was a supporter of Lorena, that she had volunteering matters. That she had a 39 vote city council race. After a bunch of recounts, and I'd had a house party. It was a bust. Had like 5 people. It was pitiful. But one of them became super volunteered for 6 weeks straight. So then it actually wasn't a bust, because that's worth 6 weeks straight of full-time volunteering is worth more than 39 votes. So, you never know.
yeah, yeah. And I think as we come to a closing, I'm gonna ask you a very simple question.
Sure.
Um, it could be yes or no, but I'll let you take the stride on it. Um, is voting important?
Yeah. It's incredibly important because it's people are like, oh, it's impure. This whole sphere is so corrupt. I don't want to get involved with politics. I don't want to sully myself. But the fact is, these huge choices are getting made constantly, and they affect people's lives. And is there going to be a budget for public health? And what's that budget going to be? And how are you going to handle a threat like COVID? How do you? I bought a used Leaf 2 years after it came out, so I've been driving, an electric car. But that's an individual choice. Glad I did it. I put solar panels in my house, but you can't solve it just by these individual choices.
Right.
And the resources that allow people to do that at scale and lend them the money and give them a subsidy, whatever it takes. If you're going to solve climate change, you've got to have major governmental action. If you're going to solve racial politics, you can't have government say, oh, well, we have nothing to do with it. It's just like, just so happens that every, month or 2 or 3, our cops happen to shoot somebody, often, sometimes needlessly. Sometimes I have friends whose daughter is a New York City cop. Sometimes they got no choice, but sometimes they do have a choice, and you've got to deal with it. And so it doesn't matter what the issue is. Are we funding our schools? What are our schools going to be like? Any of those questions, they're public choices. Who's going to pay for any of these choices? Well, is it going to be the people who can least afford it, or is it going to be people who actually, have spectacularly, amounts of money that, beyond any imagining? because that's the world we're now living in. So to abstain from that, it just it's giving up your voice in a fundamental way. And it can't, I mean, I believe in protest politics, I believe in organizing politics, but if you give away the vote, you're just giving up something so fundamental because it affects everything.
Yeah.
And if you embrace it and embrace the chance to make a difference with it, then a lot of change becomes possible. I mean, people, if this reconciliation bill passes, people are going to be able to actually afford, without, if they're not affluent, to have somebody to take care of their kids,
Right.
if while they're working. I mean, that's huge. Or pay their rent or mortgage or whatever. I mean, it's just, it affects so much.
Yeah. And
You know,
universally, everyone,
universally. Yeah,
every,
everyone. Yeah,
um, yeah, no, I think
you
that's
know.
it's the absolute best note. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, we're just emerging from a 20-year war, and that 20-year war.
it absolutely shit. Like absolutely shit.
Yeah, yeah, and that 20-year was launched by a presidential administration that got a minority of the popular vote and got in with 500, and I can't remember if it was 34 or 36. I think it's
Yeah,
534.
yeah,
Votes.
something like that.
In Florida. With some pretty ugly stuff surrounding throwing away the votes of some other folks. It was incredibly close, and 20 years of war. Country shattered, and a lot of people dead. So these are huge choices, I think.
Yeah, no, I'd have to concur with that. These are powerful words. And is there anything you'd like to add before we kind of?
Yeah, not really. I mean, if people want to check out the books, probably the easiest, yeah, soulofaCitizen.org or theimpossible.org they all go to the same place. Theimpossible.org is the easiest to spell, easier than spelling my name, although paulloeb.org suffices as well. Yeah, and then just to act and to get engaged.
Of course. Well, thank you so much. We had a very insightful and deep conversation, and I do appreciate you coming on.
Oh, well, my pleasure. All righty. Well, good luck.
Well, thank you so much.
Bye.
Peace.